just met a girl named Maria.
A warm welcome to everyone joining us here today, lovers of history, architecture, and musical theater. I'm Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel, the chair of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center, a group of dedicated individuals committed to informing the public about the past, present, and future of our city. For those who asked, today's program will be recorded and the video made available through the Diamonstein-Spielvogel Video Archives, part of the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University. Our warmest thanks to our generous participants and to all of you who gathered to commemorate the remarkable life and extraordinary work of Stephen Sondheim. Thanks also to the recent owner of 246 East 49th Street, the New York residents of Stephen Sondheim for the past 6 decades. The building is part of the Turtle Bay Historic District, one of 157 historic districts throughout all 5 boroughs. Turtle Bay is an unusual collection of 20 row houses dating from the 1860s that are simple in design with very harmonious and subtle neutral colors and very well proportioned windows. They're reminiscent, the entire assemblage, of simple Italian antecedents with stucco walls contrasted with brickwork or tile. The addition of cast iron turtles in the railing gate post provides a whimsical touch and refers to the historic cove Turtle Bay, which is now the site of the United Nations International Headquarters. The most distinctive feature of the house is not visible from the street. It is a shared garden, an oasis in the city, where low masonry walls separate individual private gardens from a central esplanade, and is graced throughout by willow trees and an Italianate fountain. Noted neighbors and residents included Katharine Hepburn, who was the next door neighbor of Stephen Sondheim, Tyrone Power, writer-director Garson Kanin, publisher Henry Luce, journalist Dorothy Thompson, and writer-journalist E.B. White, a beautiful setting for fertile and creative minds. Considered by many to be our nation's finest composer and lyricist, prolific and influential, Stephen Sondheim fundamentally transformed the entire art form of musical theater. He explored new forms and new ways of telling unusual stories. Sondheim's work displays a vast range and complexity of intellect and emotion. His shows have told stories in reverse. One of our speakers today is in one of those shows currently. He's coming directly from a matinee performance to join us. He's told stories in reverse chronology through dreams, fables, and nightmares, even in the formalized kabuki of classical Japanese theater. Through his remarkable songs, his writing often focused on relationships between people. He expressed a range of feelings: defiance, vengeance, yearning, grief, joy, artistic frustration, and humor. Alas, there are very few happy endings in Sondheim's works. Instead, he offers self-awareness and even self-acceptance writing about relational complexities with flair and very lively insights. Born to what has been described as an upper middle class, Upper West Side family, Sondheim's early years were spent in the San Remo apartments on Central Park West. At the age of 10, his parents divorced. He went off to a military school, but during the summers, he lived with his mother in Doylestown, then still part of Bucks County, Pennsylvania. A remarkable twist of fate is that one of their new neighbors was Oscar Hammerstein II, and that Sondheim, through his friendship with James Hammerstein, his son, came to meet him. Although Sondheim and Hammerstein's creations have been categorized as dissimilar as chalk and cheese, Hammerstein was an early and influential mentor, a father figure to the child of divorce. He was an elder who guided and critiqued Sondheim's first efforts as composer and lyricist. In fact, Hammerstein assigned the teenage composer a series of musical theater projects to help sharpen his talents. After graduating magna cum laude from Williams College and completing Hammerstein's musical boot camp, for the next few years, he auditioned songs and wrote for the television series Topper. His first professional music was entitled Saturday Night and was intended to open on Broadway in 1955. Excuse me. However, after the unexpected death of its lead producer, the show was canceled. However, despite the cancellation, his songs drew the attention of playwright and director Arthur Lawrence, who recruited him to work as a lyricist with Leonard Bernstein on West Side Story, a remarkable success. Sondheim was very wary of being pigeonholed as a lyricist throughout his life and his early education, including being a student of Milton Babbitt. He was very interested in serious music, what he called serious music. After this, his next musical was Gypsy, 1959, which he wrote with composer Jules Stein, a hit that was followed in turn by the popular Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, 1962, for which Sondheim wrote both the music and the lyrics. Three successes that enabled him to purchase the residence at 246 East 49th Street. Even with those first early hits, Sondheim had a somewhat bumpy career, perhaps because he was willing to take creative risks and explore unusual subjects together with his brilliant collaborators, superb librettists, excuse me, and remarkable interpreters. With subject matter that was indeed unusual, such as mass murder, assassination, and even children's bedtime stories, all examined with distinct genius and flair. His collaborator with director Hal Prince engendered Company in 1970, Follies in 1971, A Little Night Music in 1973, Pacific Overtures, 1976, and Sweeney Todd in 1979. And then came Merrily We Roll Along in 1981. After a series of remarkable critical and popular hits, Merrily was considered Sondheim's first real flop, closing after only 16 performances in 2 weeks. Excuse me. Recently revived and very, very warmly received by audiences and critics alike, the fate of Merrily could be considered a vindication of Sondheim and suggests that his work, now both a critical and commercial success, was truly ahead of its time. Sondheim went on to create outstanding, award-winning work with collaborator James Lapine, with whom he wrote the now classic Into the Woods, the Pulitzer Prize winning, each of them won a Pulitzer Prize, for Sunday in the Park with George, and the Tony Award winning musical Passion, and with librettist John Weidman, with whom he wrote the Tony Award nominated Pacific Overtures, the groundbreaking musical Assassins, and Obie and Drama Desk award-winning Roadshow. The recipient of numerous awards, an Oscar, 8 Tonys, 8 Grammys, Sondheim was honored by the Kennedy Center for a Lifetime Achievement in 1993. He received a special Laurence Olivier Award for his contribution to London theater in 2011, and a Critics Circle Theater Award in 2012. A member of the American Theater Hall of Fame in 2015, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and Fame by President Obama at the White House. He was further honored with the renaming of the Henry Miller Theater in his name. While it is still too early to assess Sondheim's enduring legacy, his work has become an integral part of American culture, appearing in movies and even television shows. He is considered by many to be our nation's foremost composer and lyricist. We look forward to our program of colleagues and experts today, who we hope will speak more about the man, the work, and its meaning. And now, our thanks to each of our celebrated and distinguished speakers. We will begin with award-winning librettist, playwright, and director James Lapine. He first met Stephen Sondheim in 1982. Lapine wrote the book and directed Sunday in the Park with George, which moved to Broadway in 1984. Their next musical in 1987 was Into the Woods, for which Lapine won both the Tony Award in 1988 and the Drama Desk Award also in 1988 for Best Book of a Musical. In 1994, their musical Passion, for which Lapine wrote the book and directed, received a nomination for the Olivier Award for the Best New Musical and won Tony Awards for Best Musical, Best Book of a Musical, and Best Original Score in '94. Their last collaboration was the review Sondheim on Sondheim, which won the Drama Desk Award for an outstanding musical review. With Frank Rich, Lapine co-produced and directed the HBO documentary Six by Sondheim, for which he received an Emmy nomination and a Peabody Award. Lapine also wrote the screenplay for the film version of Into the Woods. He deserves another award for all the informed and patient help he gave to us in planning and organizing this event today. Welcome, James. Can you tell us what were the circumstances of your meeting Stephen in 1982?
Let's see. We were introduced by a producer, Lewis Allen, about a project I had, and I met him on a Sunday. I think it was June 12th, and there was a huge demonstration. It might have been for some ecological thing. I don't remember exactly at the time. So it was mobbed over around his house. I had never been. I lived down in Wall Street financial district in a really rat infested loft. So arriving at his place in Murray Hill, where I'd never been, and walking into his beautiful house was a bit of a exciting shock. And we sat down and started talking, and we just never stopped talking after that.
How did Stephen select the subjects for his musicals or the materials? What was the process?
Well, I'm sure John Weidman, when he speaks to us too, will have his own story. So I only know, of course, how our three shows came together. And I think he looked to his book writers for ideas. I think he said, and John will tell me if I'm wrong about this, that the only show he wanted to do originally was Sweeney Todd, which he saw as a play in London and said, that's a musical, I want to do that. But otherwise, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that he worked with his collaborators to come up with ideas for shows, or with Hal Prince, obviously, as well, who had ideas for shows.
Did you work at the house?
Did
you work at the house?
I mean, we worked, all our meetings were at the house because he had his piano and whatnot, but I never wrote anything at the house. I always would write a scene every week and give it to him. This is, of course, in the dark ages when we didn't even have a fax machine, let alone computers and whatnot. So we would have to meet in person, and I'd bring over pages, and then we'd take a look at them together. And in our first show, I just wondered whether he was ever going to write a song, because I had finally written the entire first act of a libretto, and he still hadn't written a song. So I just thought, oh, well, this is probably going to be a play.
Well, what was the catalyst?
Well, I just moved forward, and I actually had received a kind of financial backing from Playwrights Horizons in the way of a grant to write a new show. So we had discussed this idea of doing the Seurat painting, which I had used in my very first theater thing I'd ever done, which was called Photograph by Gertrude Stein. It was an image that has always really, really interested me. And I showed it to Steve. We talked about it. And so I just went off and wrote the first act of that. We talked about music. He talked about things, but he just didn't really produce anything. And so finally, I was asked by the theater, well, what are you doing for this grant we've given you? And I said, well, I have a first act, and I'm working with Stephen Sondheim, and maybe we could have a reading. So we went into one of the theaters on Theater Row, and they dragged in a piano, and I had like 5 or 6 actors, and Steve sat down at the piano and played the first 5 chords that he had written. And then he sat back down, and we read the entire play. And Andre Bishop halfway through turned to me and said, are there any other songs in the show? I said, not yet. So that's how we began. But I think it really inspired him to hear it and see it. And then eventually it came in with the first song.
How much later was that?
I would imagine, a few weeks later. The fact was, he was working on it, and we talked about it, but it took, we were both pretty shy of each other, and his lack of commitment. Generally, I'm the one with lack of commitment to everything, but he beat me by far on this one. So I just plunged ahead. Of course, he was involved in talking about what I was doing every week when I brought it in and discussing it. But my knowledge of theater, particularly musical theater, was very slim. I did not start as a theater person.
What did you start as? Some of us are aware of the fact that one of your early jobs, please excuse me, I have the residue That sounds like more than residue of the flu. One of your earliest jobs was at the Architectural League. What were you structuring there?
Well, I started as the secretary, part-time secretary there, because I could type. And as you may remember, when I met you back in those days, which was a while ago, to say the least, I ended up working in sort of the area of architectural preservation. I have a master's in design, which really I don't deserve to have it called a master's in design, but that's what they gave me. So I sort of passed myself off as knowing something a little bit about architecture and design. So I worked there part-time under Robert A.M. Stern, who was president of the Architectural League at the time.
And how did you leave? Why did you leave there? You'd finally gotten a job in the theater?
Yeah, I was doing, along with that, freelance photography work when I got out of school, and I really didn't enjoy doing that. I was not really the guy you hire for that kind of work. I was more interested in sort of street photography. So I had some graphic design background, and I was doing graphic design. And I knew somebody who had the job at the Architectural League and who was leaving. And so she kind of passed it on to me. But at the same time, I was designing materials. First, a magazine called Yale Theater at the Yale School of Drama. And then the next year, Robert Brustein, the dean, invited me to a full-time position designing all the posters and programs and advertisements, and also teaching a class in design for the theater students who were studying to be artistic directors and managers of theaters.
When he was director of the drama school.
Yes, and so Brustein was the head of the school, yes. So I moved to New Haven, and I'd like to say I learned how to do theater by osmosis.
Well, somehow it worked. Yeah. Would you describe the methods that Sondheim used as osmosis too?
Yeah, I mean, I owe everything I know, certainly about musicals, to him, because I had done one musical. I'd only directed 2 plays and 1 musical when I met him, ever. And the musical that I directed was sung through. It was just an hour and 10 minutes long. So I actually did not know his work and had only seen 1 show of his ever, which was Sweeney Todd, which I was blown away by and saw 2 other times after the first time. So I didn't come in meeting him with any expectations, and also I didn't hold him up to high esteem that everyone else did, because I just didn't know better, to tell you the truth. And eventually it was the days of the cassettes, tapes, which he gave me, along with scripts of shows he's written. And I started listening to them on my little Walkman, you know, and I started thinking, oh, this guy's like really good at what he did. And then as I would tell people I was working with him, I began to discover that he was actually like the real deal and very famous. And I think he appreciated the fact that I wasn't a sycophant when I came in the door, that actually, you know, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't all puffed up. I think he was a natural teacher, Steve, the way Hammerstein was a natural teacher to him. I think he enjoyed that role with me. I was 20 years younger than him. And rather than be insecure about where my head was at, I think because he was coming off a show that wasn't successful, he was sort of inspired by working with someone who didn't know much and was going in a very different direction that he was used to going. Because I was more in the off Broadway fringe kind of theater. I didn't really go to commercial theater before.
I can understand from your simple description of your interest in photography would also probably extend to an interest in art. But whatever made you both decide to use a painting, a very well-known painting at that, to create your own outstanding work of art?
Well, I came in the second time we met. The project that I was introduced to him for was something he didn't want to do. which was an adaptation of A Cool Million, a short novella. And he said that it was too similar to Candide. So the next, he said, but let's talk about another idea if you're interested. So I came in with a bunch of images because that's my background. And one of the images was, the last one I showed him was actually the Seurat image. And, you know, it looked like a stage set, you know, they're already populated with characters. We sat and kind of chatted about it. And then I just said, well, there's one person missing. And he naively said, who? And I said, the artist. And then he went, oh. And that was kind of the light bulb moment. And from there, I just went off and started writing.
And how long did that take?
You know, it's amazing. That show, from the day I met him to the day it opened, was 2 years, which is incredibly short amount of time. The other shows were both about 3 years that we did anyway. And I've worked on shows that have lasted decades. You know, John Weidman can fill you in a little on his experiences. But again, it was just naivete. I had nothing to lose. And I just think it was incredible of Steve to turn his back on Broadway, because we did indeed go to Playwrights Horizons and develop the show there and presented the first act there. And he just loved it because there was no pressure on him. There were no expectations. We only put the show on for subscribers of the theater. And I think it was a kind of turning point for him, just emotionally, to start working on a show that wasn't with Hal and with people he knew, but to be working with somebody who came from a whole different perspective.
One last question. How would you describe his legacy?
Oh dear. Well, you know, I can't really put it in terms of the theater as much as just life in general, because he was so generous. He was such a generous person with his time. As you may know, he was president of the Dramatists Guild, which also John Weidman became. He was a good citizen. He also founded the Young Playwrights Festival, which he had discovered over in England, and thought that was something that we should have over here, where very young playwrights under the age of 18 were able to get their work performed and developed. He was always available for good causes, and he was a good citizen of the theater, as well as obviously being, you know, a genius and somebody who moved the musical forward, I think, into more serious theatrical art form. Not to put down Rodgers and Hammerstein, of course, because their stuff is brilliant, but I think Steve wanted to take it even further than where the subjects that they were working on. And I think that legacy will stand for the rest of time.
Well, thank you. By the way, what are you working on or doing next? Would you care to share that?
Oh, no.
Well, might you anyway?
Really, I think until something's finished and put out there, though, I am working on a new musical as a director. And I'm also writing a book. I wrote a book on Steve, you may know, on the Sunday in the Park with George experience that I've been talking about. And now I'm working on another book, which will not be just about him, but my particular life in the theater. So, you know, I've learned from him to kind of give back and to try to also provide what I've learned from him to other people, you know, firsthand. So those are the things that are keeping me busy. And I also, since doing the Sondheim documentary for HBO, discovered I love documentaries. So I'm working on 2 of those as well.
That's sort of full circle for your background too. I can't thank you enough for all your help and for all your contributions to our pleasure and enlightenment. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure you're doing this. I'm sure Steve would be very happy that it was happening. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, the one and only 3-time Tony Award winning Patti LuPone, who starred in Sweeney Todd, Gypsy, Passion, and Anyone Can Whistle. She even played 2 roles, Yvonne and Blair Daniels, in Sunday in the Park with George. LuPone won her third Tony Award and a second Olivier Award for her portrayal of Joanne in Sondheim's Company. A remarkable actress, gifted singer, and force of nature, she has every kind of credit, including such extensive television and film credits that I must use a phrase which I do not care for, too numerous to list, but they are really overwhelming. She's a founding member of both the drama division of the Juilliard School, another citizen who takes her work and life seriously, and John Houseman's acting company. The author of the New York Times best-selling book, Patti LuPone, a memoir. Could you speak about how you first welcome, and could you speak about how you first met Stephen?
Well, it's interesting. I live in Connecticut, and I met him socially first.
At his country house?
No, at a dinner party given by Bob Avian. Actually, I had met him earlier than that, but I don't think you could call it meeting him because I was completely intimidated by him, and I'm not sure he even saw me. I know that he saw Evita, but I didn't meet him then. I auditioned for Bernadette's replacement in Sunday in the Park. I didn't get it, but I do remember my audition and him coming down the aisle going, "I don't want any belting." And immediately I was intimidated because I didn't realize that I was a belter. I must have been, I didn't know that much about my own voice at that point. But Bob Avian, because we all live up in Litchfield County in the northwest corner of the state, threw a dinner party. And that's where I actually talked to Steve, human to human, not, composer to singer, actor to creator. And it was quite lovely. It was quite lovely. And I spent more time with him in Connecticut in a social environment than I did with him professionally.
And what came of that? First came of that.
Of the social or the
real question is, what was your first role and how did that come about?
Yeah, it took a long time. It took a very long time. I got a telephone call, I believe it was 2000, from my agent at the time saying the New York Philharmonic is doing a concert version of Sweeney Todd, and they want you to play Mrs. Lovett. And I said, "Does Steve know?" Because I wasn't sure he liked me very much. And apparently he had given his approval. And so that was my first role. And it was the quintessential New York moment because it was the New York Philharmonic with the New Yorker Stephen Sondheim on a New York stage, as the Ellis Tully. I can't remember the home of the New York Philharmonic. It was an extraordinary experience. It was my first Sondheim, and I was terrified. It's a huge orchestra. It's one of the best orchestras in the world. It's Stephen Sondheim. I got through it. Oh, I could cry right now, because it was a test, and it was a benchmark for me in my career because I finally got to do a Sondheim.
What's your favorite song of his that you sing?
I don't know if I have a favorite of his. I don't know how you can qualify that. There are so many extraordinary songs. I mean, Passion.
Tell us a few of them then.
Well, Passion, I read. It's so complex. I used to love doing God That's Good or More Hot Pies in the top of the second act because there's a duologue between Sweeney and Nellie that is incredibly difficult. And I actually said to Steve, I'm doing my best to get all of the nights. The run, will you wait there? Customers really are getting on there and I watch you. And he said, well, I wrote that. I sang it when I wrote it. And I didn't know what to make of that, whether I should not sing it correctly or it didn't matter. But there's all three of them are different with one note in the whole run. One note might be different, but I have to say that he's been my biggest teacher in musical theater. He was a taskmaster, and but I learned more about singing correctly in musical theater from Steve, because he was a taskmaster, because I was singing his music and he wanted it sung the way he wrote it, not the way I might have interpreted the way he wrote it. He wanted it sung the way he wrote it. And that is a very big lesson for, I think, any performer, where you have to really devoid. It's not you. You are giving yourself to the material. And in Steve's case, that was an insistence on his part, and rightfully so. Who's better than Steve?
Was there anyone?
I don't think so.
What aspect of his work did you find most compelling?
Well, I think that there's such a deep well of his emotional life in his work. He can be a hard ass too. He can be mean, and yet you investigate his music and his lyrics, and he was deeply sensitive and deeply emotional, and it comes across. You know, I wish I could quote some things when I went and saw Sweeney the other night, just at the very beginning, when Nellie says, "I've always had a fondness for you, Mr. Todd," at the very beginning. You'd go, it's the simplest lyric, and it's going to set that character up for the rest of the night. I always had a fondness for you, Mr. Todd, out of nowhere. We don't know her, we barely know him, and yet he has set up her inner life for the rest of the show. And in Passion too, which is one of my favorite, where it's such a revelation of his soul.
What was your greatest challenge in working with him?
The music, I have to say, I getting it correctly, singing it correctly. It's not easy material. It's very complex. And then, you know, when you marry the lyrics with the music, and honor the idea he's written, and then the clarity, as I said earlier, and I think that's really important, that we honor his intention and we honor the playwright's intention, and because it's their idea, it's their concept, it's their idea. And I think probably the music is the most complex for me. And sustaining a beautiful sound, or attempting a beautiful sound, and singing it. He actually came up to me. He thought I was tough and I could take it, and there was a lot of times where he devastated me, but he did say, "Hit the note, don't slide up to it, you're not doing your cabaret act." And I had no idea I wasn't hitting the note. And what was happening was I was afraid to hit the note because I didn't know whether I would hit it on pitch. Would I be sharp? Would I be flat? So the slide up is a way to protect yourself from a sharp note.
Too.
Pardon me?
He knew what your tricks were as well.
Well, I didn't know it was a trick. I didn't even know it was a trick. It was fear. And it's harder. It takes courage to hit the note on pitch in an interval. It's harder, but he taught me that. And to this day, when I'm singing and I hear myself sliding, I think of Steve, and then I go back and work on it so that I can, with confidence, hit the note on pitch. He was a great teacher. He was a
That's
great teacher.
clear.
I don't think he was intentionally teaching me. He was giving me notes.
Now, you mentioned that Passion had one of your favorite songs. What others are there?
Well, I lo- I love Pacific Overtures. I love Pretty Lady. I love Chrysanthemum Tea. I love of course I love singing Ladies Who Lunch. I love Worst Pies in London, A Little Priest. I sing Being Alive. It turns out I sing a lot of Sondheim. um, um, I wished I'd done Passion. I wanted to play the character that went, I got a gun, I got a gun, I got a gun, and I can't remember who the character is in Assassins, but that's the character I wanted to play. I was lucky because of Wells Kaufman, who was started out, I think, as an artistic manager at New York Phil, and he was responsible for giving me my first Sondheim role. But then he went to Ravinia, and we followed him and did 4 or 5 of them at Ravinia, and I was able to be in a lot of his musicals. It wouldn't have happened actually without Wells, I don't think, and I'm grateful for Wells for that. And I'm grateful for the fact that I had the opportunity to work with him and to know him personally in a social situation where the pressure of having to do the right thing was taken off me, and I could sort of be myself with him, which was, I don't think I was ever myself with him. He's an intimidating
Ever
character.
tell him this?
He's an intimidating character, even in a social situation. He loved my husband, Matt, and sometimes I wondered whether he could have done without me totally.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Did you ever tell him all these wonderful things?
I did break down in an interview. He's done so much for the American musical theater, and those of us that are in it. And I said when he died, my first thought was, who will make me better? I don't think anyone will. I have to remember the lessons that I learned from him.
And I'm sure you will. I can't thank you enough for your candor and your passion and your great talent.
Thank you so much. Thanks for including me.
Thank you. Our next speaker, John McWhorter, has been a Stephen Sondheim aficionado since his senior year in college. He's a keen analyst of Sondheim's work and has written extensively on Sondheim and the history of musical theater. He's a professor of linguistics at Columbia University, a New York Times columnist, and a specialist in language change and dialects. He's also the author of numerous books on language, including 9 Nasty Words and Woke Racism. Both, by the way, are New York Times bestsellers. He's perhaps the scholar best placed to parse Sondheim's complexities and music. He noted that his songs often require several listenings to fully grasp. That's how most of us feel, Professor McWhorter. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Barbaralee.
Before we begin, might you tell us what the 9 nasty words are?
It's been a while. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say them, but they were damn, hell, shit, fuck, dick, bitch.
I don't know if I should go on with it.
And there were a few others. And so they were very nasty words, and some that we probably shouldn't say in this setting, but the idea was to cover what we consider profanity to be, both in the past and here in the present.
Would you characterize Sondheim's lyrics as a dialect that is unique to him?
Well, certainly. I mean, there is definitely a Sondheim sound, but I would think that it's not just a Sondheim dialect in that Cole Porter had one and that Flaherty and Ahrens have one and Sondheim has one, but more, or in the case of those two, Ahrens has one. But it's more that I find Sondheim's work to be the quintessence of making both music and lyrics integral to telling a story about interesting people, where the music and the lyrics actually parallel and enhance how people would express themselves in speech. He nails that in a way that never ceases to amaze me, and he did it as soon as he hit the ground. And so he never writes a lyric that sounds written, as they used to say. It always fits the person exactly. And so you get things like, I've done it 3 or 4 times. That's better than it would sound if that person said it with a martini glass in 1970 somewhere on the Upper East Side. The music enhances it. Or even little things like, they say that George has another woman. I'm not surprised. That sounds exactly the way those people would have sounded walking through a museum. And then, because it's so catchy and a little bit fey, it enhances it. Or an example I'm not sure people think about, and he might not want me to say this because, or wouldn't have wanted me to say it because it was just lyrics. This is him not doing the music. But in Gypsy, goodbye to blueberry pie. Where did he get that? You know, no one said anything about blueberry pie, but the image is instant. You know exactly what he means by blueberry pie. That's what Rose could have said. And in terms of that music that Julie Stein provided, that is an absolutely perfect line. Who else would have come up with goodbye to blueberry pie when writing what Some People is supposed to be about? He was a master at that. And so what a dialect it was.
You've said that Sondheim was the guiding star of your life. Excuse me. Could you speak more about his importance to you personally?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I wasn't raised on musicals. I didn't care about musical theater until I was almost out of college. It just wasn't part of the background. I grew up with classical, jazz, with pop of the 70s. Musicals, I didn't know what a My Fair Lady was. I had no idea. Fiddler on the Roof, how good could that be? That doesn't sound interesting if you don't know what it is. And then a friend of mine dragged me almost physically to a New Brunswick production of A Little Night Music. And I didn't know what that was. I thought maybe it had something to do with Mozart, and I knew Mozart. I didn't feel like I needed to see it acted out on stage. Really, I was deeply ignorant. And about 15 minutes in, when they were doing Now, Soon, Later, I thought, wait a minute, what is this? This is one of the most amazing things I've ever heard. The music is absolutely gorgeous, and the lyrics are more clever than almost anything I've ever seen written down. And I'm obsessive, and so I thought, well, okay, this is just one thing that he did. It's 1985. I've got to hear all the rest. And it was fun in those days because it's still the era of the LP. You can't just snap your fingers and listen to something by, putting in earbuds or something like that. So you had to collect. It was like getting baseball cards. I remember when I started, Merrily We Roll Along on LP didn't have It's a Hit yet. And so could you hear It's a Hit? Because nobody was doing productions of it in 1985. You had to find it. Or when the double LP of the Follies concert came out, and finally you could hear One More Kiss and Rain on the Roof and the full overture. I remember almost tearing up, actually hearing Follies sound better than on that awful original Capitol album. And all sorts of experiences just hit me again and again. I was obsessed, but there's this thing called Sweeney Todd. And Sweeney Todd was newish in 1985, and all the Sondheim fans I was getting to know kept telling me how important Sweeney Todd was and how I just had to hear it. And that didn't sound very interesting to me. I thought, well, Company, Follies, Little Night Music, funny thing, that's good. But this barber who's cutting people's heads off, how good is that going to be? But people kept talking about it. And so one cloudy Saturday afternoon, I got stretched out on a sofa and listened to this Sweeney Todd thing from beginning to end. I would say that was one of the most significant 2 hours and 45 minutes of my artistic life. I thought, this isn't just musical theater, this is God. And so next thing I knew, I was doing stupid things like being on the streets of New York and seeing Paul Gemignani after something he had been doing, and it was late at night. And I said, Mr. Gemignani, sorry to bother you. I don't do these things these days. But I said, but what is Sondheim's next show? And memory distorts. I could swear what he said was Out of the Woods. but I've never read anywhere that that was a provisional title. But it was Into the Woods, and apparently it was. And so he really has been a lodestar in my life for just the utter art and craft of the musical theater form. He brought me into being a musicals obsessive, and a part of me thinks of him as basically looming above everybody else who's been a practitioner of the form, both before him and after him. It's actually one of the most significant artistic oeuvres that I will ever be aware of.
Well, I think many of us share your sentiment, but not the ability to express it quite so fluidly as you have.
It's the passion.
Yeah, that is clear. You ever surprised how an audience responds or doesn't to his work?
What surprises me at this point, having been part of his fan club since before he was cool, is that now he is so cool, that his work is done so often that it is appreciated by people who are not especially interested in musical theater, that the Sweeney Todd music is now thought of as just great stuff by people who saw the movie, who will probably never see Passion or Here We Are. It's been interesting watching, and you don't want to say that the public's ear has grown up, but the public's ear has gotten used to Sondheim in a way that I would never have expected in, say, 1985. You're walking around New York, and the shows are these enormous British messes with these 3-chord songs. Sorry to sound like such a snob, but that's how those shows hit me. And you think, well, if this is what normal, interesting, bright human beings like, why in the world is Sunday in the Park with George ever going to be anything but a specialty taste? And maybe you had a little bit of smugness feeling that way in, say, 1987 or 8. But no, the public gets used to different things. And as a result now, Sondheim is, of all things, mainstream. I have lost count of how many people made sure to go see Here We Are recently, who really aren't especially into musical theater. And if they are, it's not necessarily the musical theater that you have to listen to 7 or 8 times. But Here We Are was something that one wished to get a look at because it was his last work. I never thought that would happen. It's interesting watching the evolution of taste in that way.
He once noted in an interview that the rhythm of every country's speech determines their music. He observed that opera is so hard because it's so hard to translate, and the speech does not match the music. Could you explore that idea and explain it a bit for us? And are you in accord with it?
Yeah, there is something to that. Languages do have different rhythms, and it doesn't utterly determine the music in a mechanical sense, but it does mean that lyrics can be more effective in conveying ordinary humanity in certain rhythms than others, depending on what language you're using. And it can make translation very, very difficult. So, for example, Janacek's operas are in Czech. It's murderously difficult to try to make them work in any other language because the people are speaking Czech, and that's what the music does. And to tell you the truth, it might surprise you to know that I am a linguist. I love other languages. I also love musical theater. The two of them together, the bridge, I don't usually cross. And so I have several translated versions of Sondheim musicals, actually in the room that I'm sitting in, which, to be honest, I've never really listened to because I want to hear them in English. If I want something in Catalan, I'll listen to something else, and probably won't. However, with the translations of Sondheim, and there are an unusual number in Catalan, for example, I pity the translators because the rhythm of, for example, Iberian languages is quite different from ours. And I hear that Brazilians love their Sondheim, but there's a part of me that thinks that it couldn't quite be hitting them in the same place that it hits us. That's the nature of translation in general, but Sondheim must be a special challenge. I have listened to translated Cole Porter. Cole Porter works in German for some reason. I get the feeling they're hearing pretty much what we're
Well,
hearing
they're
when it's
shorter rhymes, and by the
for
time
example.
to the 5th 5-line rhyme, you really get the idea.
Exactly. So yes, I think that there's definitely something to that. Sondheim's work is wonderful for transcribing educated, agitated, late 20th century American English, put it that way.
Do you think his complexity has affected the popular or critical assessment of his work?
I do think that the complexity has affected that assessment. When I was a lad, I remember there were 50 somethings who just didn't get Sondheim. They would say that it wasn't melodic, etc. And we kind of laugh at that now. But these are people for whom a musical, it's supposed to be Fiddler on the Roof or Kiss Me Kate. It's a challenge to take in, for example, a Little Night Music, if that's where you sit. Frankly, there's just more going on harmonically, for example. And so you have to get used to it. The idea that it's not melodic was always ridiculous, but you have to strain to get the melody maybe a little bit harder. And so, yeah, the complexity was a problem at first, which is why it's so wonderful that the public ear has embraced that complexity. Sweeney Todd is not easy music. And a great many people are now listening to it and enjoying it. And not just the parts that are loud or that are in minor key, but they get it. And it's really partly just a matter of repetition. Sondheim stuck around long enough, and these pieces gradually made their way into the public ear. But yeah, he didn't always make it easy. And I think with Passion in particular, he went beyond where a lot of people so far can go. I'd be interested to see where Passion is in that ear, though, in about 25 years.
Well, I have a suggestion. I've always thought that Sweeney Todd would end up on an opera stage.
And look at the way it more or less has, because that's
Well, I think
exactly where it
it's
belongs.
incrementally getting there, to full productions. Might you speak about his trajectory as a composer from the more traditional sing-song musical to today's current, more fluid form?
Yeah, I think Sondheim was very good at boxing himself into, for example, Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, where it's just a story and you need some songs. But even there, you can feel him kind of bursting at the seams. Love I Hear is, as a structure, much better than that song needed to be, especially at that time. You can feel somebody who's working against the structures of the conventional, quote unquote, golden age musical theater form. And he was very good at moving along to, for example, Passion, where if you're sitting there waiting for a sequence of numbers, you're just not going to get it. And truth to tell, Sunday in the Park with George took me a while back in the day, because it's one that expects you to listen in very closely at very quirky and specific feelings, very few characters. That's quite different from anything Victor Herbert or De Silva, Brown and Henderson, or even, say, Schmidt and Jones would have worked with. Sondheim was very good at that. It's one of these things, as a life gets longer, you keep saying, well, I wonder what he would have written more. And you say that about Gershwin, but Gershwin died at 37. If you've had the benefit of having lived much longer than that, then it gets a little abstract to say what more could there have been. But I would be interested to see what he would have been writing, say, 20 years after here we are, going into really unprecedented directions in that sense of narrative that's fragmented and less straightforward.
What's your favorite Sondheim?
Night Music, partly for sentimental reasons. See, I don't really, that was my first one. I always say that's my favorite musical of all time, but what is your favorite musical? I really, Follies. Follies is my favorite of all of them. And I feel bad saying that because it's so early. Can't I get over Follies and embrace Roadshow, etc. But Follies for me is the one that just leaves my head spinning every time at this point. Night Music would be a very, very close second.
Is there anything else you'd care to share with us? I know that your handyman is waiting.
He's going to ring that bell any second.
And I don't want to keep you too long, but one last word.
Well, I would say that for a professional reason, I was going to meet Stephen Sondheim not long before he, that sentence didn't come out right. I was set to meet Stephen Sondheim professionally, and then he happened to pass away before it could happen. And I had really wished that I could tell him how often he has reminded me why life is worth living. I was so looking forward to doing some interviews with him. And, maybe one day in a different world, I will, but that happened. And so here we are.
Here we are. I can't
See
thank
what I
you.
did there?
Yes, I did. I can't thank you enough for all your work, but especially sharing some very personal and informed thoughts today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Barbaralee.
And now we have heroic Jonathan Groff, who was just finished a matinee performance of, here he is, welcome. You did finish at about 4 o'clock, your matinee performance today. And I think it's very generous of you to come straight and roll along to us, and we appreciate it. Actually, it is for those who don't know, which seems hard to believe, I will remind you that Jonathan Groff is currently co-starring in Sondheim's Merrily We Roll Along. Two very fine, in fact, rave notices, enough that I see it's been extended and extended through July, if I recall. It's quite a trajectory for what was considered his first flop. How do you explain this new passion, if I may mix my metaphors here, for Merrily?
First of all, I want to say thank you for having me here. I'm in my dressing room right now between the shows and have just this is so inspiring to hear all of these incredible speakers and to hear your questions. And I was only in his home on 49th Street one time. It was after he'd passed, and it was to meet Maria Friedman and Jeff Romley to talk about potentially joining them in this production of Merrily We Roll Along. So the only time I was ever in that home was for that meeting about this show. And it feels related when you ask about what has changed about Merrily or why people are responding to it now. To me, a big piece of it for us is Maria Friedman, our director of this production, who had played Mary in the 90s in the UK. In the production that she shared with us, Sondheim and George Firth, who wrote the book, never had quite felt like they finished writing it. And they did it in California and they did it in DC. This is after the Broadway run. And then they came to do it in the UK. And it was this production that Maria was a part of where they put their pencils down and said, okay, this is the version of the show that we're happy to call the finished version. Frank has a child in this version. Gussie is a larger character in this version. And so that's the version that we're doing. And then Maria, through a funny set of circumstances, ended up directing a college production back in 2011, I believe it was, which then her sister Sonia Friedman, our producer, produced at the Chocolate Factory, which then went to the West End in 2013. And now here we are over 10 years later doing it on Broadway. And I guess the biggest change from the original production in 1981 would be that in the original production, it was a lot of teenagers and kids in their early 20s playing the roles. And the conceit in this version is that it's actors like me and my co-stars are in our late 30s, starting the end of the story at 40 and ending at 18. So it's a grown-up.
That reverse chronology may have been one of the original, shall we say, barriers that people weren't really accustomed to having a story unfold backwards, so to speak.
Absolutely. I think that it's what many of the people were speaking about before too. the way that our ear has also sort of grown accustomed to the Sondheim sound. And the Into the Woods film with Meryl Streep comes out, and then going to see it on Broadway last year is like going to a rock concert because it's full of fans. I think people's ears and their taste is ready to hear the material in a way that probably it never has been before. And I think that perhaps, I don't know, I didn't see it, but perhaps having teenagers playing those first several scenes, how would they possibly know what it was like to have two divorces, et cetera, holding martinis and having and being full of regret. I've had this personal, I talked about this with Lonnie Price. He came by to visit last week, who was the original Charlie, and made an incredible documentary called The Best Worst Thing That Ever Could Have Happened about Merrily that is just phenomenal. But I was saying to him, I have this philosophy after playing it now for a bit on Broadway. It feels so personal, and Sondheim in interviews said that the only truly autobiographical song he ever wrote was Opening Doors, and that it's him and Hal Prince and Mary Rodgers.
Oh, wow.
And so if we
Can you
take that,
remind us of some of those lyrics?
oh sure. We're opening doors, singing Here we are, funnily enough, and I think about Here We Are every time we sing that. Uh we're opening doors, singing Here We Are. We're filling up days on a dime. That faraway shores, looking not so far. We're following every star. There's not enough time. Um, and if you take that principle that that is the most autobiographical song that he wrote, I'm also reading Mary Rodgers' amazing memoir right
Yes,
now. And she was in love with talks about being in love with Sondheim for, her whole life. And
yes.
looking at Mary at the end of the play and looking at that unrequited love and looking at what happened eventually between Hal Prince and Stephen Sondheim and playing out the relationship of Frank and Charlie and the animosity and the selling out and the compared to the artistry. I can't my personal philosophy is I wonder if either consciously or subconsciously they were casting kids because it is so autobiographical that how could you watch adults play out the drama of your life? It feels so real to be out there playing those scenes as adults. So that's part of my personal theory too of maybe why there was teenagers in the original production.
That's quite an insight. Let me tell our audience a little bit more about you, if I may. This young man began his Broadway career in the hit rock musical Spring Awakening. Happy to say I saw you back in the dark ages. It was really quite remarkable, for which he was nominated for the Tony Award for the Best Leading Actor in a Musical. He also earned a Tony nomination for Best Featured Actor in a Musical for his memorable role in my favorite king, George III, who made us all possible. George III, he played in Hamilton. I'm sure that stuns people to see you here and to realize that you inhabited that character. He is known to television audiences for his work in the long-running musical series Glee and as FBI agent Ford in the period drama Mindhunter, for which he won a Satellite Award. Well, you certainly had a very early start on Broadway, and your story is very much one of learning through doing. Did you ever feel that you missed out by passing the more usual paths of education and training? But there you were in the first show and a star.
Yeah, I moved to New York when I was 19. It's funny at the high school science fair when, I was 16 years old. I was sitting there with my geology project. It was something with water and rocks, and I don't remember what it was about, but I remember it was sitting there on the table and my feet were propped up reading a biography on Stephen Sondheim. This was
Oh,
like I knew when I was a teenager, um, just very clearly that I wanted to come to New York and I wanted to do theater, and I watched James Lapine's, the VHS of Into the Woods and Sunday in the Park with George. I grew up on those. And so my passion was so um intense that I was reading a lot of books, and watching a lot of theater and coming to New York as much as I could, that I thought maybe I would go to college to study it, but when I got this non-union national tour of The Sound of Music my senior year of high school, and so I went on this tour and made
how'd you
10,000.
get that?
My mom drove me up. It was my senior year. My mom drove me up to an open call in New York. I had learned about Backstage magazine from actors that I'd worked with at a theater in Lancaster, Pennsylvania called the Fulton Opera House. And so I subscribed to Backstage. I found this advertisement for the Sound of Music tour. I had played it in community theater, Rolf, and so I came up with my senior photo and a hand-typed resume of high school credits and ended up on this tour and made $10,000 and thought, if I make $10,000 in a year as an actor, I'll never be able to pay off my college loans. So I'm going to take this money and move to New York. And I would say that I learned so much from doing, and I really am a sponge, especially getting the opportunity to live in New York. The first week I was here, I started volunteering for Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS and holding the buckets. Tom Viola, I waited on him at the Chelsea Grill of Hell's Kitchen, and he signed me up to be a volunteer. And so I was seeing the second act of musicals my first year here and going to auditions, and then a year later, after living here, it happened for me with Spring Awakening. But my first Broadway show was a flop called In My Life, where I was an offstage understudy in swing.
Did you ever redo it?
I would like did I ever go on, you mean, as the understudy? I went on in the ensemble, but never for the roles that I played, that I understudied. But the opening night party of In My Life, which was a short-lived 2-month show, was at the Hudson Theater, which is where we are now, before they had turned it back into a theater. So it's a bit of a full circle moment here.
You've said that Sutton Foster is one of your greatest influence. You obviously feel a commonality with her, and I wonder if you would tell us why.
I remember seeing her in high school. When I was in high school, came up to see Thoroughly Modern Millie, and I remember feeling two things. I remember feeling the heat coming off of her. You could almost see, like, on pavement when it's really hot outside and you can see heat waves. It was watching this young girl with it had heat waves emanating off of her from this understudy that got pushed into this role, and she was just primal and visceral. And I remember also the way that she listened on stage. She was so present. There was such a level of presence about her. I was completely taken by her. And when I would wait for her at the stage door, she would really take people in when she spoke to them. And yeah, she was my hero.
Is she still?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Big time. I absolutely adore her.
Well, you're lucky to have that kind of influence. Who else are your great influences?
Oh my gosh. Well, like, honestly, watching Patty do her interview with you just now, and I wanted to name out all of the favorite songs that I've seen her do. I mean, her being alive is like so incredible. And she did, and this interview that she referenced just now when you were speaking to her is so beautiful and so worth watching. And she thanks Sondheim on behalf of all the actors. And when Patty was here at Merrily last week, and I got to thank her for saying that to him, sort of like John right before me was saying, I almost had the moment where I could say, you know, thank you for all that you've done. And Patti really did that for all of us in this interview. But yeah, I mean, Patti and growing up watching Sunday in the Park with Mandy Patinkin and Bernadette Peters, the list goes on and on and on. I'm as much of a theater fan as I am a actor.
As you know, Merrily closed after 2 weeks and 16 performances. How do you and your fellow cast members account for the new, more than enthusiastic response to the new production?
It's shocking, honestly, for all of us. We had hoped that people would want to see it and that they would want to come, but that the show is landing in this stratospheric realm of success is kind of mind-blowing to all of us. I think it's, you know, if I had to guess, just me personally, I'm not an expert in how or why things become hits, but I think with the Sondheim films and the productions and the popularity that he's gained, particularly in the last 10 years, I think it's exciting for people to feel like they're discovering an unknown Sondheim because it hadn't been produced so often before this. And I think on kind of a spiritual kind of meta level with everything that's going on in the world right now, um, Maria's take on this show. First of all, she says she doesn't have a take. She says that she is just presenting the brilliance of George Firth and Stephen Sondheim. So let me, you know, speak on behalf of her that she really believes that the piece is perfection and brilliance, and she believes that she's just offering up the piece as it is. But she said to we talked a lot in rehearsal about love and friendship, and that this musical is a love story about friends. And in an even deeper way, it is about the opportunity for us to start again. It's never too late to have a reset. And the way that she's contextualized the show, it's Franklin, the character of Franklin Shepard, who I'm playing, reflecting back on his life. And she bookends it in a way that the show itself is him going backwards in his mind, reflecting on the choices that he's made. And then in the last moment, we see him again and wonder if maybe he'll make a different choice. And the optimism and the purity of our time, the song and the scene is so life affirming and inspiring. On stage every day when we were rehearsing the show, I couldn't practice the song without hysterically crying. And it wasn't until we got in front of an audience and it felt like, okay, I have to communicate this. I can't get stuck in my own emotions here. There's the whole, you know, who knows why they wrote it to go backwards. I know it's based on a play, but that commitment to that theme, uh, they're gone, so we'll never know from their mouths about it going backwards. But it feels to me like watching the characters touch back to that origin of joy and pure passion is an opportunity for all of us on stage and everyone in the audience to touch back into that too. And in such a crazy time in the world, so much to get sad about, to be reminded in a musical of what it felt like to be full of dreams and to know that those dreams won't go away feels pretty life affirming for this moment in time.
Well, your performance was called Thrillingly Fierce by the New York Times. Is that what you had in mind? Because I didn't see it that way at all.
Thrillingly fierce. I mean, there is a ferocity. It's interesting because Frank is a character, is a straight character written by two gay men. And I don't believe that the character of Frank is gay, but it's interesting because being inside of the character, the emotionality of what I experience feels very familiar. And this sort of passivity that Frank can have, for example, in the brilliant Franklin Shepherd Inc. song that Daniel Radcliffe phenomenally performs 8 times a week here at the Hudson. It's an interview scene, and the character of Charlie, played by Dan, goes off. It's a tour de force song, and the character of Frank doesn't even have a line of dialogue in this exchange. So the interviewer speaks a bit, but it's this kind of tour de force, and it isn't until the song is over and the room is cleared and they're sitting alone that the rage and the ferocity of Frank appears. And there are these moments, these flashes in the show where Frank unleashes his rage. And I think that part of where that rage comes from is at least in the playing of it, is this tendency to repress and suppress that to me feels very familiar as a formerly closeted gay man. And when those opportunities to unleash come, it's almost like I can finally express something deep within me that I didn't even know was there. So, I mean, who knows what reviewers are referring to, but fierce, when I think of the ferocity of Frank, that's the first thing that comes up for me.
Well, I think that you're up to your 5th performance tonight. It is so generous of you to do this entr'acte. Really marvelous. And it was wonderful to talk with you. But I do have one last question, if I may. There
Sure.
must be other Sondheim roles that you'd like to play. What do you have in mind?
Well, it's funny, first of all, I want to say it's such truly an honor to be included, and thank you so much for having me. Before I answer the question, this is really a thrill to be here, and I'm so inspired to do the show tonight after hearing everybody talk, so thank you. Other Sondheim roles, honestly, I mean, we're here until July 7th, and um, I, I'm not done with this one. I'm still, every night, I mean, and Patty was speaking to this too. Every night you go back and you find something new, and I go, oh my God. Oh, I mean, I mean, we learned, this is early on now, but when Dan is singing, in Franklin Shepherd Inc., um, inside, inside at the end of the song, it's the same at the end of that song in Act One, is the same notes as our time. There is endless connections and puzzles and unraveling and revelations to be had in his material. I am not thinking of the future. I am with the lesson of the show, trying to stay in the present moment, and it isn't even trying. It's a pure joy to stay in the present moment and just continue unraveling this piece and this role with these incredible actors.
Well, thank you for your generosity in sharing some very personal and interesting thoughts. It was a pleasure to see you on stage, but even better up close. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye for now. Well, this has been a much longer program than I had in mind, but I hope you share my interest and frankly enthusiasm for the generosity of these gifted speakers who have been so willing to share with us some very large and some very personal thoughts. Our next speaker is John Weidman. He is the son. Welcome, John, and thank you for being so patient.
Not at all, pleasure.
He is the son of the renowned American playwright and novelist, Jerome Weidman. But John Weidman has a brilliant career of his own. He wrote 3 scripts in collaboration with Stephen Sondheim: Pacific Overtures, In the Glory Days of Japan, as I recall, a little bit earlier, 1976 to eight, that all those 80s was even more significant, I think. Assassins, 1990, and Roadshow, also known as Bounce, in 2003. Pacific Overtures was nominated for both the Tony Award and the Drama Desk Award for Best Book of a Musical. Assassins, in addition to being nominated for a Tony for Best Book, received both Tony and Drama Desk Awards in 2004 for Best Revival of a Musical. A Harvard graduate, Weidman completed his law degree at Yale, though he has never practiced law. Since 1986, he has written for probably one of the longest running, most widely viewed programs of all time, Sesame Street, receiving more than a dozen Emmy Awards for outstanding writing. In 1996, he was awarded the Cleveland Award for a Musical Theater, and from 1999 for the entire decade to 2009, he served as president of the Dramatists Guild, another person with a sense of civic responsibility. It's a genuine pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
How did you first meet Stephen Sondheim and start to work together?
Well, my journey to Steve was very different from the one that James Lapine described earlier. I was a law student at Yale in the early 70s. I'd kind of drifted into law school wondering what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I had no particular ambitions to have a career in the theater. I'd been going to the theater my whole life, but I saw myself as a lifetime member of the audience. I had the obligatory summer job as a law student at a firm in New York. And by the end of the summer, I thought, this is not going to work. This is not for me. Whatever I'm going to do with the rest of my life, I'm not going to be an attorney. And I did the kind of thing that you do at a certain age when you don't know any better, which was to imagine alternatives, one of which was to sit down in the Yale Law School library and write a play. And so I did that. And the play I wrote was called Pacific Overtures, and it was about Commodore Perry's expedition to open Japan in 1853. I contrived to get it to Hal Prince, who I'd met when I was a kid. And Hal was very taken with it and actually wanted to produce it as a straight play and set those wheels in motion. I was coming into town from New Haven for casting sessions. This was all for someone with no background in the theater. This was all a little mind-boggling at the time, but I was going with the flow as we did in those days. And then one day Hal called me up and he said he'd thought about it and he thought actually the play didn't want to be a play, it wanted to be a musical. And I thought what he was just saying was, I'm not going to produce your play. But he sent it over to Steve, and Steve's first reaction was that it was interesting. He wasn't sure it was a musical. Maybe it was a play with music. Hal was nothing if not good at persuading people to do whatever it was he wanted them to do. And so eventually he talked Steve into joining the two of us in order to convert this piece into a musical. And so when Steve entered the room, he was entering a room in which Hal Prince was already the preeminent theater person who had preceded him. And Steve and I then, in conjunction with Hal, put one foot in front of the other and turned the straight play into a musical. And, you know, I had been, unlike James, who described arriving at Steve's house, not having a whole lot of ideas about who Steve was or what he had written. I had, before I stepped into the room as their collaborator, I had been a huge fan of all the Prince Sondheim shows. I had seen Follies a couple of times. I'd thought Night Music was brilliant. I had seen Company. And so stepping across the line from being a fan to being a colleague was thrilling, but also a little intimidating. You know, James's description of Steve was very accurate. the first time I went to Steve's house on 49th Street, 50 years ago, 1975, 74, to work just with Steve, not with Hal. I can remember going upstairs and entering the study in which Steve basically did all his work. I worked with Steve for 50 years. He never once came to my apartment for a work session. I always went to his house. He was installed on that couch in his house the way Nero Wolfe was installed behind the desk of his study on his brownstone on 35th Street. And I sat down and Steve and I just started to talk. And there was no sense in the room of one of these two people being already one of the giants of the musical theater and the other guy being a kid from New Haven who had an idea for a show. We were immediately engaged in exploring alternatives, options, his openness, his patience, his willingness to pick up an idea and work with it to see if it was the right idea, then maybe back away and pick up another one, was present from the first time he and I ever worked together. I mean, Pacific Overtures had its own dynamic because Hal was kind of the hub of a wheel around which the show was created. And that was true of all those other Prince Sondheim shows. You know, Hugh Wheeler wrote the book for Night Music, but it was still, the fundamental collaboration was between Hal and Steve. Same with Follies, same with Company. My second collaboration with Steve on Assassins had a very different dynamic to it. But that was, you know, all of a sudden I found myself working on a major American musical with Steve Sondheim and Hal Prince. And, you know, I guess 2 years after I sent the play to Steve, I found myself standing at the back of the Winter Garden Theater for the opening night of not just my first show, not just my first Broadway show, but my first show of any kind. It was a heady experience.
Wow.
Yeah, wow is correct.
Well, what was it like to be working in his house all the time? And his this and his that. How did that relationship work out?
Well, as I said, Steve had worked with a variety of different librettists, obviously prior to me. Arthur Lawrence was a prominent American playwright, George Firth, Jim Goldman on Follies. These were all men who had much more experience in the theater than I had. But I never had any sense in working with Steve that the fact that I was a neophyte affected the way in which we worked together, exchanged ideas, arrived at what we thought were the right ideas for songs, all of which, as I said on that first show, involved conversations with Hal Prince as well, because Hal had been at the moving force to get the show moving forward. But I think, you know, we can only describe our own experience, but I think Steve and I, we liked each other personally, but I think we found each other in a creative conversation very early on. And I can't exactly explain why that was, but I was always very much aware of it. And so it always felt like a very easy give and take with him in terms of where we were headed and what we wanted to do. I never felt intimidated by him. He was, you know, James used the word generous. He was a very generous collaborator always. That was always my experience with him. And also, as James said, he relied very heavily on his librettists. You know, the most of the shows, with the exception of Sweeney Todd, began with an idea which came from his book writer. And Steve, you know, if you read his two books on lyrics, he describes himself as sort of his relationship to the material he was working on as a matter of him learning the language that the librettist was inventing for the piece, absorbing that, and then kind of falling in gait with what the way in which the librettist was pushing the show forward. And I think that's Steve being maybe unduly modest, but that's the kind of guy he was to work with. He was a dream collaborator. I've worked with other people. I've had very good collaborations. None of them were as satisfying as the work with Steve. And obviously part of that is because Steve was a genius, but a lot of it just had to do with the way in which he wanted to make art.
And you both did make art. By the way, did you ever consider doing a theater show of Sesame Street?
No, I have to say, I just want to put Sesame Street sort of in the right context for this conversation. After I wrote Pacific Overtures, I wrote another musical that was done regionally, the Hartford stage and a couple of other theaters, but I still wasn't quite sure what I wanted the focus of my career to be. And I wrote screenplays for 3 or 4 different studios during this period of time, and they would all these movies would proceed through several drafts, and then for one reason or another they would stop. And I flew home from LA feeling a little demoralized about the 4th one, and I walked in my living room, and my daughter, who at the time was 3, maybe 4, was sitting on the couch watching Sesame Street, a show which I had never seen because it didn't exist when I was a kid. And I knew it as a cultural event in America, but I never watched it. And I sat with her, and I was really, really impressed with how witty it was and how sort of worthy the work was. And I knew a couple of people who worked for the show. And I also had enormous admiration for Jim Henson and for the Muppets outside the sphere of Sesame Street. And so, you know, I went through the audition process you had to go through to see if your sensibility fit with the sensibility of the show. And I was a good match. And so then every year after that, I would do, also there was a kind of a writer's room at Sesame Street, but mostly you could do as much or as little work as you had time to do from year to year. And so it became a kind of a perfect fit for my career in the theater. And it also meant, you know, I could take my daughter, who was 4 years old, to the studio and introduce her to the Count. But I could also explain to her what I actually did for a living by saying, here's what Big Bird is going to say next. And then Big Bird would say it. She'd say, how'd you know that? I said, well, I made it up and I gave him the words. So I felt, again, I feel like I've been very fortunate in the different twists and turns my career has taken, but that was one of them.
Well, I still can picture it as a musical. I can't remember the name of the show from England about 4 or 5 years ago. That was really based on children at school.
I'm not sure. You mean Matilda?
Sorry,
No, show from England?
I can't remember the name, but I could picture some version of Sesame Street.
Well, there was a great deal of music, obviously written for Sesame Street over the years by very talented people. So Avenue Q, I guess, is about as close as anyone's gotten to putting
Yes.
Sesame Street on stage so far, but we'll see what happens next.
But musical theater, as most of us knew it, or know it, had its beginning about 100 years ago, and it is deeply entwined with the immigrant experience and their use of the Rialto to discover things about their past and their lives. Are we at the juncture with the many diasporas and the enormous immigration that has taken place in major cities throughout the United States? Might we be at a juncture of a new form?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about musical theater, I think one of the things that has happened over the course of the last 10 or 15 years is that stages have become welcoming spaces for people who are writing from different experiences and different backgrounds. You know, the musical theater was largely the creation of white men, Americans, and other voices had difficulty finding their way into those spaces. And I think that's already changed dramatically and will continue to. And it provides everybody who goes to theater with a richer experience and a richer array of experiences they can have when they go to a theater and you know, when the curtain goes up, which is all to the good for all of us.
Did your collaboration with Sondheim serve any role in preparing you for Sesame Street?
I would say no. I would say one of the things that was nice about Sesame Street as a kind of a sidebar to my life is that it drew on a very different part of my brain and my sensibility than what was activated when Steve and I would sit down in a room together and decide to write a musical about everybody who'd ever tried to assassinate the president.
Do you have any current thoughts about musicals?
Yeah, I've got something that, I mean, I did a very satisfying revisal of my dad's musical I Can Get If You Wholesale last fall, so down at Classic Stage off Broadway. Very, with a terrific director named Trip Coleman, a great cast. And I've got a show now which hopefully has found a slot at a theater here in New York and might go up it's unlikely, might go up as soon as next fall or certainly, a year from now. So I have things, I have irons in the fire,
yes.
irons in the fire, things I'm waiting to find out about.
Can you give us any hint about next year's play?
I think the smart answer to that is the one that Lapine gave you, which is no. I think that it's wise to leave these things undiscussed until suddenly they burst into the public arena.
Well,
Because you
look
never know what's
forward
going to
to
happen.
that. But there is a long list, though, of notable musical theater composers, of whom Sondheim was very critical. Even Oscar Hammerstein, his mentor, as you know, did not escape his criticism. Whose work did he like?
Steve? Well, I think if you, I want to be careful because I don't want to toss out a couple of names and then realize afterwards that they were the wrong ones. I mean, I think if you go back to Steve's 2 volumes on lyrics, he expresses without reservation his enthusiasm for certain composers and lyricists and his lack of it for other ones. So I'm going to direct everyone's attention to those 2 books rather than try and pull
There's
names
one
out.
right behind me.
You know,
But he is certainly very candid, and you're very guarded, and I don't blame you.
well, if Steve were here, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer the question himself. I'd rather not answer on his behalf.
Okay. Who is your favorite Sesame Street character?
I was a big fan of the Count because he was obsessive, compulsive, and based on a vampire. So that seemed to me to be a great combination of qualities to create a character for a children's show.
What's your favorite Sondheimism?
Sondheimism?
Yes.
Well, I mean, if you're asking about the shows and about the songs, one of the things that is obviously true of Steve, and I think it's been evident in everything that everyone has had to say about him during these conversations, is that Steve wrote for character. And with maybe the exception of Send in the Clowns, it's hard to think of more than 2 or 3 of Steve's songs that were kind of breakout songs that were covered by a lot of other people. And his ability to write sort of a perfect song in the perfect spot for the character who could sing it, because it couldn't really be sung by anybody else, is one of the things that I've always found really breathtaking about his work. And so if you name any show, I can name 2 or 3 songs that I think are particular favorites of mine. I mean, certainly from Pacific Overture's Bowler Hat, Someone in a Tree. There's several from Follies. I guess, rather than just sort of cycle through a list, I will say that there's a song of Steve's that has always meant a lot to me, particularly in terms of my relationship with Steve and the time I spent with him and our friendship. And that is Finishing the Hat from Sunday in the Park. I feel as though Steve, wrote a song about how art is created. And it was a song written by one great artist, Steve Sondheim, about another one, George Seurat. And while ultimately, the song has a kind of exhilaration at the end, look, I made a hat where there never was a hat, the body of the song really describes the price that an artist pays in order to reach that point, in order to finish the art, in order to accomplish what he sets out to accomplish, and what's left behind and what's left out, perhaps. And it always feels to me as though that song, and it may be presumptuous on my part, I don't think it is as close to anything that Steve ever wrote that was very specific to a particular character, but also had a kind of an autobiographical quality to it. I mean, you know, my feeling about my enormous affection for Steve and for, you know, what he meant to me and what we meant to each other. I feel like a lot of what his life was like is kind of embedded in that song. And so it means a lot to me. I mean, the night he wrote it, the night he finished it, I was at home and the phone rang and Steve was calling me. And this is Sunday at the Park, it's not my show. And, you know, I had been the fourth person on a list and the first three weren't home and didn't answer, but I was home and answered. And he didn't want to play me the song or read me the lyric, but he obviously had just finished it and he was so excited about what he had achieved, about what he had just created. And it is the last line of the song. Look, I made a hat where there never was a hat. And he just, it's emotional for me. He clearly felt some need to share that with somebody, communicate.
Well, you know, that very heavy book that I have spent many hours wading through, called Finishing the Hat,
Yeah.
always puzzled me why that was the title. Could you explore that for a moment?
Well, as I said, I think what the song describes is ultimately the exhilaration of filling an empty space with a piece of art. I mean, in that sense, you know, what Lapine starts the show with, when George is staring at a blank piece of paper, which will be filled up over the course of the show, but it's blank at the beginning. And every song that Steve ever wrote was a blank piece of paper in the beginning until it was completed. And I think Finishing the Hat was a reductive way of describing that experience. I mean, George's inability, his unavailability, the fact that he's not available to Dot in the way that she wants him to be, is because there is a part of him that is always separate and preoccupied, in that case, with painting the hat. And that, I think, that experience of finishing it was what is obviously what the song's about, but I think it was an experience that Steve had over and over and over again when he would get to the end of a song and really feel as though he had done a perfect job of accomplishing what he had set out to accomplish. And when you look at the variety of songs that he wrote, all of them each for a specific character, it's breathtaking. His ability to finish all those different hats, for all those different characters in all those different situations and all those different shows is, well, as I said, it's breathtaking and very emotional for me when I think about it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your generosity in sharing your thoughts. Thank you for coming to spend all this time with us. We're very grateful.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Look forward to next fall. And now our last guest is the Tony Award nominee, Emmy winner, and newly minted Grammy, Grammy nominee, Liz Callaway, made her Broadway debut in Stephen Sondheim's short-lived, recently revived, now that you know a great deal about, Merrily We Roll Along. But that began a long-term professional relationship with him. She performed in a number of live concerts in his honor, including a Stephen Sondheim evening at Lincoln Center. She appeared with Sondheim on Inside the Actors Studio and played the role of young Sally in the Lincoln Center concert production of Follies. For 5 years, she appeared as Griselda in Cats and managed to survive that. That is amazing. Her most recent album, To Steve with Love, was nominated for the 2024 Grammy. There were a lot of contenders, and I know you must have had a wonderful time there.
I
But she
did.
is someone who has sung Sondheim for many years. Dare I ask you how many?
Well, when I first got the company cast album, when I was 9 years old, I would sing along to Another 100 People and actually all the songs on the album. So I guess you could say since I was 9 years old, but then professionally since I was 19, and Merrily We Roll Along.
Well, for someone who has sung Sondheim for so many years, how would you describe his personal style?
Oh, wow. Well, no one wrote like Sondheim. He wrote for characters, he wrote for people, he understood the human condition. I always say I love to sing Sondheim because I get to be smarter than I am, and I get to say his words and sing his words. There was no one like him, and there never will be another Sondheim.
Well, I think you were in good company today because
Oh,
that
yes.
was reiterated many times today.
I know, and I have to say, I so enjoyed listening to everyone. I choked up many times, and I so agree with so many of the things that people said. You know, it was wonderful hearing Patti talking about
Marvelous.
she wished she wished she could have thanked him, and how it felt to perform his songs. And for me, this album and this show that I've been very lucky to do all over the place is in a way, it's my thank you to him. It's called To Steve with Love. And actually that is a play on To Bobby with Love, a lyric from Company, and also To Sir with Love, because he was a teacher. And like Patti said, I learned so much from him.
As a singer, do you believe that there is a consistency, a thread that runs throughout Sondheim's work, or does he simply excel in every genre?
I think he excels in every genre. And something I always appreciated about his writing, that you don't know unless you actually sing his music yourself, is how much he thought of the singer. He thought of how you would form a lyric, you know, a patter song like Getting Married Today. I actually don't think that Sondheim is hard to sing. I think he did so much work for you as an actor, but also he took such care in writing. He put himself in the place of being a singer, and how would the mouth work in these lyrics, and so to me, his songs are easy to sing. They're not easy to learn, but once you learn them, then they're just a joy to sing.
Am I correct that your Grammy nominated show is going to be traveling throughout the United States?
Yes, I've done it in New York and LA and London, and I just did it in Madrid. I actually just got a booking on May 22nd to bring it to the Ridgefield Playhouse in Ridgefield, Connecticut. So if anyone is in the area, I hope they'll come. I just did a sold out concert of it at the Kennedy Center, and it brings me such joy
What
to,
was the subject of the Kennedy Center?
it was my show to Steve
Yes.
at Love. My album is a live album of the show. And so it includes 16 songs, but also stories that I talk about, Follies in Concert and Merrily We Roll Along. And what's interesting for me is I worked with him when I was very young. And I was always very intimidated by him. And but I was so young, and so I understood his music to a certain degree. But now being older, and singing songs that I sang first when I was 21, I understand them so much more now. And he also was a
There
gift.
are many layers of meaning, as
Yes,
we know.
yes. And especially, he wrote some great songs for women older. It's not easy getting older in this business, but his final gift to me were all these songs that I can explore now as I'm older, and I feel so lucky and blessed to have known him, but that I'm going to continue singing his music and introduce his music to newer generations as well, and that's really important to me.
How would you assess his contribution to musical theater?
Well, I think he was the Shakespeare of musical theater, and his music and his shows, I think, are even being more appreciated now, which is incredible. But I think that's how I would describe him.
And which are your favorite Sondheim songs?
Well, I'm very fond of Move On. I love the line, anything you do, let it come from you, then it will be new. Give us more to see. That I did. I think you mentioned James Lipton, Inside the Actor's Studio, and I did that many years ago. And Jim Walton, who starred in Merrily, and I sang examples of his work. And he was sitting about 6 feet in front of me, and he was interviewed by James Lipton, and then we would sing a song that he had just talked about. It's terrifying because he was right there. But at the very end, we sang Move On, and then we turned and I sang that to Steve. And it was one of those, unforgettable moments.
How would you like to sing something to us?
Oh, okay. Well, there's a lot of songs that I could sing for Steve, but I think since we talked about Merrily We Roll Along throughout this, there's a song from that show that I think anyone who worked with Steve or knew Steve, they might share this sentiment. Not a day goes by, not a single day, but you're somewhere a part of my life, and it looks like you'll stay. As the days go by, I keep thinking, when does it end? Where's the day I'll have started forgetting? But I just go on thinking and sweating and cursing and crying and turning and reaching and waking and dying. And no, not a day goes by, not a blessed day, but you're still somehow part of my life, and you won't go away. So there's hell to pay, and until I die, I'll die day after day after day after day after day after day after day, till the days go by, till the days go by, till the days go by.
Brava. Thank you. Thank you. Very moving, very beautifully sung, and a cappella, no less. We are very privileged to have you join us. Thank you for your words and your beautiful music.
Thank you
And
for having me.
now, I think we will turn to the dedication of the cultural medallion. We've asked James Lapine to read the text of the Stephen Sondheim Cultural Medallion. And we ask him to do that now, please. Thank you again, James Lapine. And most of all, thank you to all those who participated in this exciting program and who helped make it possible. Thank you to our audience. And if any of you know of an individual who has made a significant contribution and you have verifiable information about where he resided, or she or they resided or worked in a building that still stands, no phantom buildings, please let us know. James, would you kindly read the medallion?
I shall. Stephen Sondheim, March 22nd, 1930 to November 26, 2021. The address is 246 East 49th Street in Manhattan. Considered by many to be our nation's foremost theatrical composer and lyricist, Stephen Sondheim was born into affluence on the Upper West Side. At the age of 10, his parents divorced and his mother took a house in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where they were neighbors of the renowned lyricist Oscar Hammerstein II, who became an important mentor. After graduating from Williams College, magna cum laude, 1946 to 1950, his earliest successes were as a lyricist for West Side Story in 1957, Gypsy in 1959, and A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum in 1962, which was the first Broadway show for which he wrote both words and music. His original and varied works include Company from 1970, A Little Night Music 1973, and Sweeney Todd in 1979. Merrily We Roll Along and Sunday in the Park with George, 1984. I skipped the whole thing. Sweeney Todd in 1979, Merrily We Roll Along in 1981. His collaboration with me included Into the Woods in 1987 and Sunday in the Park with George in 1984, for which we won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. The recipient of an Academy Award, 8 Tony Awards, and 8 Grammy Awards, Sondheim received the Kennedy Center Honors for Lifetime Achievement in 1993. In 2010, a Broadway theater was renamed in his honor, and in 2015, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. This is the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center who is responsible for this beautiful medallion, which stands outside Steve's home. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Can we go back to the photograph of the medallion? Because I'd like to show you all something. If you look at that gate post, right up here, there is a little turtle with, I guess, a sense of irony for Turtle Bay. Thank you all for your patience, your interest. Most of all, thank you to all the speakers, each and all of whom were remarkably insightful, generous, really wonderful. I hope you had as good a time as I did. Thank you.
Isn't it rich? Are we a pair? Me here at last on the ground, you